Wonderful. All right. Hi, everyone. I think we are now good from a tech perspective. Um, it is really great to be speaking to everyone today on the topic of climate and energy finance, winter study style. I'm dialing in here from sunny Williamstown, where it is, a very blistering 14 degrees. So exciting to be back on campus for sure. And um, what I'm gonna, start off with is a little bit about me and that introductory background to add on to what you've heard. So I am a 2011 graduate of Williams College, and I'm a first generation college student. When I finished Williams, I had completed two majors, one in literary studies and one in art history and practice. And I spent time on many activities, but I'd say most of my time on the record. And so the obvious thing to do was, of course, to move into climate and energy finance. And so you could see clear as day how that happened. Because that's a joke, I'm extra excited to come back on class and talk about the work that I do now. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I got an MBA along the way and took kind of a fun career path to get here. But I think the Williams slide informs what I'm hoping to teach the kids, which is what I wish I knew. So climate and energy finance, coming at it from that perspective of you have your liberal arts bubble, purple bubble now. The mountains are still purple, which is great to see. And how can you turn that into something that encompasses this sort of broader field? And so I share that students can expect to see a little bit of a survey to the careers of climate and energy finance here, and then get some of the practicals. And so you can see on the left of the screen, what are climate and energy solutions that are out there now? What are the different roles in the world of finance? And then, what's going on? I can't explain the events of the last week. This webinar is at a time of great federal transition, but suffice to say that there are always current events going on in climate finance. And I'd like to help the students get a flavor of how to do some topics in finance and energy. How would you read a financial statement, create a financial model, start decoding that language of finance? Hopefully, by taking this course, they can learn a little bit more about what they may want to do if they want to enter the field and feel comfortable going out and seeking those experiences that are going to take them further. So with that, let's get into the content. What brings us here today? Well, we're going to start with our problem statement. And so what brings us here is a great challenge, and it's great. It's fairly simple. So the greenhouse gas effect, perfectly natural process. Thank you to NASA Kids for this graphic, but effectively the atmosphere is trapping heat, and that's what it's meant to do. But because of some human activity, we've accelerated that. We've increased the heat that's trapped here, right, within the climate of our Earth. And here's a picture of the enemy, as it's often discussed, carbon. If we had carbon gas, I couldn't show you a photo of it, but when you talk about climate change, challenges in energy, you might hear carbon tax, or the carbon balance or the carbon problem. These are all, carbon's acting as a metonym, an umbrella term for all of the gases, methane, SOx and NOx, that, the way we live, the way that we power our screens and our lights, happens to generate. And so when we think about climate change, often we hear about the carbon or greenhouse gas emissions that we're looking at to mitigate. And this is a systems problem. So talking about the stocks and flows of our greenhouse gas emissions, I'm borrowing this graphic from Dr. Donella Meadows, who wrote a great book, Thinking in Systems. And she outlines that in the simplest form, any system is what you put in, the inflow, how much, how fast, the stock of what's there, and then the outflow, which is the same. So we can insert carbon into this equation and think that, everything we're seeing now, from rising global temperatures to the outcomes of those global temperatures, is because of this balance of what we've emitted into the air and what's currently staying there. And taking it one step further, systems will create feedback loops. So here is again just the simplest diagram. What's up there can affect how fast the system keeps going. And a fun feedback loop that she mentions is simply coffee. Maybe you've reached for your afternoon coffee now because you're tired. You've taken a sip. That's so great. Now you're a little bit less tired and you can keep going. That would be a balancing feedback loop. So you're taking the coffee, coming back up, balancing out the energy level and moving forward. And then when we're talking about climate, we're often talking about runaway feedback loops. And I'm not going to show any graphics today about any of the environmental disasters that are happening or have happened, but you can think of a wildfire as something that instead of balancing out, the more you feed it, the more it grows. The more you feed it, the more it grows. And these are simple concepts too, but it underpins why when you're thinking about the climate topic, you're really looking at, complex global ecosystems coming together. And we know this. This is my favorite punchy UN graphic. This is the cover of a report that the United Nations released in 2023. And for those who don't want to zoom in, the text shares that, broken record, temperatures hit new highs, yet world fails to cut emissions again. And so then we have to think, okay, there's climate, there's changes that we know we need to make to bring these systems into balance. Who's going to pay for this? Who's gonna fix it? And when it comes to footing the bill, then I look over time from the same report as who has contributed to that stock of carbon and those challenges. And this is a more complicated graphic than it needs to be to show that it's the countries that have developed economies that have really come in and put most of that carbon balance up into the atmosphere. And so this is historic over time. This is still happening now. And I emphasize for the students a US centric class because that's where my experience is and because I think we need to get to work since we've been emitting so much. This is from a wonderful nonprofit called Project Drawdown, which I first encountered as a coffee table book. And they have reams of public data going back to energy solutions and climate solutions, and also the sources of our greenhouse gases. So if you take a look at this lovely large graphic, I just focus up on electricity. The production of the electricity that we use to do all the things we do is a huge source of emitting everything that goes into the atmosphere. And for us, it's important to think about how we can decarbonize and clean up that area of our, day-to-day lives. And so together, we finally have a title. It's Climate, Energy, and Finance. So we've been talking a little bit about the science side of things. Let's go into finance's simplest roles. And so finance is often a multifaceted and maybe complicated industry to an outsider. I certainly knew almost nothing about it for almost all of my time at Williams, but I think finance can be boiled down into three simple roles. Grants. Are you giving someone money? Are you as a person giving dollars away and there's no structured agreement for anything that might come back to you, payment wise in goods or services or cash? You could also be an equity, an owner, investor. And so you might say, I'll give you some money and I'll take some ownership, maybe ownership in your company or maybe ownership of your energy project. We talk about solar arrays, we talk about groups of wind turbines, those are energy projects. So you could either give money to those who are building it and develop that and own it yourself, or you could be a lender. Debt sometimes gets a bad name, giving money can be a challenging area when it comes to the downsides of transaction and then the lender maybe taking ownership. But most renewable energy projects get done with debt. That is when you're giving money, but there is a structured agreement as to how you're going to get that money back and what types of returns you're going to be. These are the very simplest ways to think about moving capital and money from one hand to another. And this is what all of the complicated financial instruments are ultimately based on. We're going to come back to this. But with that in mind, let's take a look. risk and rewards are different, the lifestyles, the questions that you might ask yourself as an investor in any of these roles would be very different. You might be someone who's seeking, transformational change. And so you might be more over here on the left side of the screen. You might be someone who just wants to know the work's going to get done. And that might put you more in the role of lender. This means, though, especially for students who are starting their career and those of us who are excited, no matter where we are in our careers, that you can consider topics, methods, and impact, mix and match across climate and energy finance. So we've talked about finance, all these different roles on the top, right? These different industries on their own. Energy, all these different roles on their own. Climate itself, you could look at energy, or you could look at how energy powers buildings, etc. There's always an and more. There's just an interconnected web of things you could think about that go into this umbrella bucket. And I'm excited to be introducing students to these over the course of just a few short weeks. Let's take one level deeper, peel back the layer on some of this energy stuff. So the US grid was not built with renewables in mind. And I share that because that is a reason that there's just so much work to be done. We did not plan our electricity around a renewable source. And, to go back from a historical perspective here, we began in the US with a single generation station. I, coming to you as a proud alum from the great state of New Jersey, I'm happy to report that just as you suspected, the story begins there. And it begins in Thomas Edison's lab, very near where I grew up in the center of the state. And so, as we all know, at least some details of, in 1879, Thomas Edison came out with this filament burning light bulb. Shout out to Lewis Latimer and others who worked with him in the lab to make this huge advancement. Now we have a light bulb. And now people can install electricity in their homes for the first time. But Edison, in order to sell this product to different people and get inside consumers' homes, had to build a way to power these light bulbs. And so the first generation station in the US was founded by the Edison Company in 1882 in Manhattan, Pearl Street. And so if you lived within a few blocks of this substation, you could have the electric light bulbs in your home powered by Edison's substation. It did burn down, so I should share that in 1890. But, nonetheless, obviously a great step forward. And there are a few lessons we should just take away from this as we move on. The first is you could see the horse and buggy out front. Coal was shipped in order to power this plant, right? And the second idea is that it is one large station, a hub and spoke model going out to different homes. So one place where you can continually add fuel and then disperse that among homes or buildings. The grid is wild. Like if you think of where we are now from Edison burning down a substation in lower Manhattan to where we are today, I think it's great for us to just pause as we're here and think of, again, the espresso maker. Maybe I have coffee on the mind. If I want this incredibly expensive espresso maker in my home and I want to run it all day, I can. Do I need to ask permission? Do I need to sign off with any governing authority if I want 100 espresso makers in my home? No. I, as a consumer, within some limits, I expect that I can buy these appliances and I can plug in my electric car and I'm going to get electricity for my home. And so I'm just going to show a texty excerpt from a document that came out of FERC, one of the federal regulatory authorities on this. We expect electricity on demand in the US, no matter what we do. And so to highlight in here, consumers want the electricity whenever they want it. They also want to pay a reasonable price. I don't want a home full of espresso makers, and I don't want to run that home and then get $1 million bill the next day when that's wildly out of sync with what I've been paying. I want a reasonable price. And I want all this, despite what's at the bottom down here. It is a challenge to store any appreciable quantity of electricity economically. It is hugely expensive to store this item, unlike the coal and Edison substation. but I want it when I want it. And so those who are operating the grid, feeding energy into that grid, need to be able to generate it instantaneously. And finally, for the econ majors here, as I was not, there is inelastic demand that does not move with prices. That means that when I need my refrigerator running, I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to pay for it no matter what other challenges are going on or what cost constraints I may have. So just one other note, you have this system where demand is now changing all the time. As we're just going to see next, this is where renewables and the business of renewables can get a little hairy. So if you're thinking of starting a business, my fun icon for this, or how you're going to intervene as a financier or investor, start thinking of these problems. We basically need solutions firing on all fronts in order to resolve these issues. So a renewable energy source can challenge the grid. How? Especially if I'm a proponent of, say, solar. I think the easiest visual to show for this would be the solar duck curve. This is a graphic put out by the system operators of California, and whether you can see my mouse or not, I don't know. You can see in the top curve, this teal bar from 2019, that basically this is what it was like without renewables, more or less until they came onto the grid, a few renewables on the grid. So effectively in the morning, we don't need that much power going left through right until we start our days. We kick off, we turn on our espresso makers, we get ready and we go to work. And then we don't quite need as much electricity because we're all at our offices, but also the sun is shining. So now at noon to 3 p.m., we don't need as much fossil fuel, we can use the sun. However, we all come back home at 6 p.m. When we come back home, we want to turn on our lights at home and start making dinner. And so, in short, over time from 2019 down to this red line in 2021, renewables have stressed the grid because they've created a dramatic curve throughout the day where when the sun is shining, we can use a lot of them and we don't need the other power sources, but we have to ramp up and ramp down around that. That's very stressful for a lot of the technology we use to power the grid, and it creates another challenge. So once more, a way for you to be in the world of climate and energy finance, looking for solutions, because these are real things that are even more dramatic than this curve shows since it ends at 2021. And there are going to be problems, or there are problems that are going to need to be solved in order for us to decarbonize and do what we need to do. Why is it called a duck? A lot of people have agreed it looks like a duck to layer these different years on top of each other. I appreciate this graphic and everyone who's in this world making artistic and energy and finance decisions together. And so we go. Anyway, let's go back to finance's simplest roles and peel back one layer there. So we talked about you can give a grant or an incentive, you can be an equity investor or owner, or you could lend money in this field. I'm going to show you the climate capital stack. Think of stacking different sources of capital together, different types of categories of where you could get your money from in order to pay for this project, in order to pay for doing this work. And that could be going to a company or an energy project. So whether you're building that solar or you're creating the software that's going to help optimize that solar for the grid, you could be accessing this climate capital stack. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time walking through all the topics on here. And this was put together by, you can see CTVC in the corner, Climate Tech VC, great resource, especially for learners, a lot of articles that can help you get up to speed if you weren't an NVI major and haven't spent time as an electrical engineer. So highly recommend that for anyone who's interested in learning more. When we go and look at this, let's first orient from left to right on the screen. Typically, when your company or your project is in its infancy on the left, you might need grants and catalytic capital. As you're more developed over to the right, you might take advantage of these other sources of capital. So to bring it together, there are different returns that investors expect to make. you could see on the left, grants, 0, right? I'll give a caveat here that there's an overcomplication to any possible finance instrument you could look at. There are many permutations. These are the basic categories that are vanilla ice cream in a field of 500 flavors, but I think it's important still to ground at what we could learn in order to then get to those more complex concepts. And so on the grant side, you might be a company that is needing, say, dollars from a university to conduct your first study. Maybe you're proving out your technology in a laboratory and you win an award or a fellowship to do that. That could be grant funding. That could also be government funding. Catalytic capital, very challenging category to box in, doesn't love a box. Here we see that catalytic capital could have a return of 0%, that second bar saying I'll get nothing, but there can be catalytic capital investors that expect to command a higher return. And there's no one size fits all approach to catalytic capital. We have to think of what's in that name, a catalyst. The idea is that someone wants to invest a relatively small amount of capital compared to your overall capital need to kickstart the bigger expansion. An example of that might be someone who lends you money to do your next big demonstration and offers you a, if it succeeds, you can repay me type of approach. There are other investors who could be catalytic capital. Next, we think of venture capital. A lot of the students have heard about this and find it interesting because venture capital could be related to all these startups. People are trying to solve these challenges left, right, and center using different methods to do so. Another way to kickstart companies' growth, particularly if you envision enormous growth. So we go through this field just as we go through venture debt, its cousin closer to the middle. When you're ready to take on debt, it probably means that you have some idea of how you're going to pay it back. So that means you have some more cash flow, revenue, and these products in the middle can be helpful to companies that do have a path to greater growth. Finally, I'm in debt. So I'm happy to say boring old debt on the right. You have commercial debt, which could be helpful for building your business, and you have project finance. These are different fields. You know, all of these different investing styles could be something you spend your whole career working in and becoming an expert in. But you could also mix and match. You might see that the firm that is doing your project finance is a bank. And so they're lending you money to build your project. You're taking out a loan from them, but they also have a commercial debt arm. You might see a venture studio that has a grant or a catalytic capital arm. So it is as complicated a world as it could be when it comes to climate, finance, and energy. But the goal today is just to give you an idea that whichever style is your style, however you want to approach the problem, you can do it. And I think there is something that, excuse me, that really underpins what I'm hoping to do in this winter study for those who are excited to take this rather than the things that I took, which were more like mural painting and some other activities. You know, this might not be a major that we offer, and you might have not majored in what's closest to what this work is. But depending on your interest, you can hold nearly any function and do all of this work, and you can take a number of focuses. So it's very exciting. It could easily be a whole major, not a winter study taught by just me for a brief period of time here on campus, but it's an exciting class to be in and a field to be in too. And I'm, interested in just sharing too before I want to open it up to questions. And then I'm gonna share this. I'm gonna open up to questions, and if we need to go to other slides or go back to other slides, I'm happy to do that in the course of answering those. But if you're an alum or you're someone who's considering teaching a winter study, I have found it really encouraging that there's so much that you've absorbed just in your daily life that could be a resource for the students. So I might name check a resource that I found valuable as a learner. It's free. It's great for helping them to decode something that otherwise they're going to have to ask in their first job. I like to say too that the stakes have never been lower. If you don't understand what venture capital is, I'm not an expert in it, but I can tell you. And truly ask me anything, I'd so much rather you learned here than getting into a professional setting and feeling afraid or unsure of who to ask, or if you don't have a connection here, who can you ask about this? So those are some parts of the experience that have been great. And I'd also share that if you're passionate about trying to help these very smart students learn anything more about what you want to do or get experience in your area, this is a great place to do it. So I have a lot of respect for the program. There's always someone to help you with the tech. So if you're not sure about that, you're very lucky. Williams does great, and they're really engaged and far more serious than I was in winter study, which is an awesome thing to see. I'm gonna do one more thing before I think we're at, well, we're close. Almost time for questions. I'd love this to be interactive on different topics, but there's there's old Excel. So here's a quick glimpse. We're right now building an Excel model. Don't look at this too closely. It's not the Excel model we're building. We'll go back to this slide, but Excel is finance's tool of choice in that it hasn't been supplanted by another way to just fundamentally build up calculations yet. And so no good way that I know of to do a Zoom with 100 plus people and Excel, but that is a skill, really just can you operate the software or not, that has been really exciting. The students have been calling for. So we've been integrating that with some great guest speakers and a little bit of lectures like this. With that, I'm going to pause. I would love to hear any questions from you all and where we should dig in. Thank you. As the reminder, use the Q&A function and I will see it. Well, I hope I'll see it. As I'm looking through, wonderful, both boxes are coming in. That's awesome. So I think so there's a note here in the webinar chat that I'll just look at first as I sift through which Q&A to tackle. We're still using Excel rather than SQL or coding languages, but I'll share, another interesting resource for someone who wants to come in and learn more about the field or just hang out with people who are doing this is climate tech cities. And I share that because we had a guest speaker come in yesterday who's the co-founder of a network called Climate Tech Cities. There are two founders. Basically, if you're in one of the cities, you can sign up to a newsletter, and every week you'll just hear who is meeting in which group in the general field of climate. And so I think that's a great resource. I could probably pop that into the chat, but for now, I'll share that the founder comes from a coding background, and he spoke to our class and shared that while he's done some finance and some climate, it seems like as he's continuing his work not only on that, but also with climate VCs, an understanding of how AI at smaller shops could inform the type of coding that you do is becoming important, especially for more junior, like the students would be, graduates in the field. Didn't get one AI tool out of him, But I think while we're comfortable in Excel, we have to be ready for other things to happen. And let's see. There is a question here. Do I cover the investing of the college's endowment in clean climate projects? I'm going to answer that one live. I don't. And so one interesting thing to share when I'm coming up with this is how to narrow everything down. I could be talking about ESG, maybe is it alive or dead? Or what does it mean? We started talking about tax credits for renewable projects the other day, and so I had to throw together some slides for a future lesson on that. I think this is not an easy field to pin in. From a climate perspective, you could speak about all these things. From an energy perspective, you could still have a whole class. And focusing on things like publicly traded stocks or the investment of the endowment are things that other classes do really well. I know some about those, but I think we have enough to do without getting too deep into those areas. So I've just chosen not to go in on the Williams side. And then there are many questions on the future. That's interesting. I think the strategies emerging. Yeah, so there are some questions around what, well, there are several questions around what I think will happen at the federal level as the different branches of government come together on especially the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a piece of the legislation that was passed under the now previous presidential administration. I'd say it's too soon for me to give you any cogent idea that is worth anything. So I don't know how to predict what will happen, but I'd share that from inside, sort of looking and talking with developers, if all you do is develop, you've made your whole multi-billion-dollar business out of developing solar or developing wind, you're probably not going to switch to drilling to oil, like drilling for oil tomorrow, because it's a very different shift. And so my hope is that with enough developers sort of focused on the space and continuing to do their regular business, we're not going to see necessarily a near-term slowdown of these projects being installed. I think it's more of a question for maybe for our students, honestly, are there the jobs there to get into this business? Like that could be a bit challenging as people think longer term. But that would require long-term strategizing in the face of what's happening now. And I I'm not ready to do that, just ready to build a model. So when it comes to financing mechanisms, that's a great question. I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen so that I could pull up another slide and you don't see me skipping over to it. And we'll see how we go there. So there's a question, what new finance mechanisms are you most excited about? And what have you found success with in New York? I'm going to show a quick case study from the class. And I shared that. I wasn't sure if we'd have time for it today, but I talk quickly and you all have good questions that I think can be helped with this. So I'm going to show you the case study that I think shows some different mechanisms coming together to support a company. And so I'm going to pull this up now with any luck, right? And wonderful. It'll be time to continue. Okay. Someone tell me if the screen is invisible, but otherwise I'm gonna believe it's working. So I want to talk quickly about a company that combines a few of these ideas together. It's called 9.Energy. They are based in New York, where I am based. And they are an installer of storage. So battery storage in this case, installing batteries around and across New York City, at least as their start, in order to access more of that sunlight, any of the clean energy we have, but the New York grid is pretty dirty, but they're nonetheless going to be here installing storage as a mitigant to access that renewable energy so that when the sun goes down, they can power the grid. And they started off at the Urban Future Lab. This is an accelerator based out of NYU, our other friendly purple company, or purple college based in Manhattan. And they got some investment. If you go to Crunchbase, that's one place to see where there's debt financing or equity invested in a company. And I will share that I happen to work at this moment at New York Green Bank, and Nine Dot is a company that we have lent money to. And so they had a big announcement in 2022. First, they started off at Accelerator. They were able to get debt financing, and then they had an over $100 million investment from a group called Carlyle, split between Nine Dot and another company. So I'll spare you the words on this page. This is the sort of thing we step through step by step with the students, but seeing if we can decode kind of the debt, the equity, the different roles here. But they were moving from, grant and nonprofit supported financing to now a very large equity investment. Then to keep going, that was 2022 and 2023. That's when we closed our transaction where we provided them a $25 million revolving credit facility to help finance at least 14 battery storage projects. So to go to the question of what are interesting financing mechanisms, I think you can work to use debt now in a way that equity previously had to work. So trying not to lose people who may not be familiar with this, I'll share that, early when things are risky, when you're pulling together the permits to install your batteries or your solar or your wind, and you're trying to get sign-offs from your engineers, from your local community, that's a risky stage in the process. And typically it's been reserved for if you have the money, the equity dollars already, great. Maybe you can get some incentives or grants, but if you can't, it could be a little out of luck. And we worked hard, another team at the Green Bank, to figure out a debt facility that would help them at that early stage before they connected their batteries to the grid. And so quickly, we're not the only people who have been in here. 2022, 2023, now during winter study last year, they were able to secure an additional $225 million of equity capital from their existing investor and their new investor, Manulife Investment. And, to pull that forward, they're just doing great community work. Like, this is their project on the ground in the Bronx, where they worked with a local school and a local artist to take, I'd say, a wonderful liberal arts approach, right, to integrating different disciplines in order to build this renewable installation. And they're getting more money to do so, which is really exciting. And then we look at the investment path together. So how do these mechanisms come together? First, you have the company being founded on the left. Then you move on, you have this grant-oriented role for the company. They took advantage of an incubator based out of a academic institution from the Urban Future Lab. Then they got equity. Then they went through another incubator program co-run by Wells Fargo and NREL, a federal resource for clean tech. Then they raised debt, received equity and debt, and we're continuing forward. We've actually had a number of other exciting announcements that go sort of off the page here, and I think this is one way to kind of quickly pull together for just one renewable energy company the different types of financing mechanisms that we were discussing. And let's see. Great questions here on Data centers. Great. So we have a question about the role of large energy consumers being a catalyst for more clean energy financing. I think the data center question, as opposed to a question from someone that is building specifically renewables, um, data centers demand a lot of energy. And so there can be, and they're at the moment seemingly a great place to get profit. So you might be interested in investing in building a data center. That's not the work that I do, but if you're looking to get a strong return, we can go back to the slide that shows, different people in the climate capital stack. You could say, hey, data is going to be required, and I'm going to be able to make a good return on my investment if I go there. So I'd like to invest in a data center. I I do think that there is a potential conflict between the profit motivation of it has to run and it has to be, you know, operating when I need it to maximize its value. And I'm comfortable solely doing renewables on there or doing renewables and adding some storage. So data centers are driving, among this capital stack, they're driving a fair amount of renewables development, and they're also being attached to traditional gas-fired plants because those are reliable. And as long as you, like Thomas Edison, shovel in more inputs, you can reliably get the energy output that you need. I'll just show here, this is a graphic from a company called Grid Beyond. I think this encompasses that complex web that we're looking at. There's a mention here about density. It's true in an urban density setting, you can't really locate everything on the left, smack in the center of the city. You might look to the buildings that can get solar from the sun. Not every building is set up to actually catch the sun's rays in a good way based on, how much time you're in shadow, you might not be able to capture that. You may not want, you know, certain types of plants in the center of where people live and work. And that's how environmental justice communities came about, is unfortunately a lot of the more polluting projects have been over time cited in communities that are generally lower income and now suffering worse health outcomes. So there are a lot of questions that go into where to site these exciting new projects. And I think a balanced and thoughtful approach would be required. Let me see. I'd share from a new technology perspective. We talk a little bit in class about what climate tech could be. And so people are working on different types of batteries: an air battery, an iron air battery, a battery powered on sand, or the chemistry rather is sand, versus the lithium ion that we all know. I think those things are exciting, but I take the maybe more boring lens on the debt side that I am not personally set up and interested in being someone who's on that innovative arm of technology development. I'm closer to deployment. So debt is looking to deploy what's ready to go today. And that is a philosophical conversation worth a lot of hours of inquiry. There are schools of thought around we need to keep developing the tech, and of course we need to just get things done and get money out the door. Everyone's right. We have to do it all. I am interested, if it's a new technology or a new solution, in what's closest to solving the problems that'll get it deployed soon. I'm glad there are many EIFs who are well set up to be in the laboratories actually creating these solutions, and that's exciting. But on this page, I would share then that battery storage is still relatively nascent. You could see some batteries powering a data center in this graphic on the bottom right. Also, the VPP approach. So a virtual power plant, this idea that this company that created the graphic is putting forth, is on the lower left side. And so this is sharing that we typically had a grid operator. What about if we could have all these resources together and take a smarter approach to operating the grid? We used to have one person dispatching power externally. What if we use technology and we use software to better manage all these renewables and probably the gas or the nuclear energy that we already have? I'm excited by advancements that make use of our current built environment. People who are creating microgrids, a very similar idea to this graphic, virtual power plants, and trying to harness all the things that we already have to come up with creative solutions. Bridge financing, legislations, strategies. I love this. I will answer one. I have been totally remiss in sharing that I am here as a private individual expressing only my own views here as I do in the classroom. And so let me just say that now before I keep discussing the potential future. So any strategies emerging as we enter a more challenging time for climate finance at the federal level? That is a great question. What new strategies could be emerging? I'd share that if you get into climate and energy security at a more local level, what's good for a region, when you dig down deeper, it's always been a local question of how you're going to power your home. And there's still so much great work going on the ground. Federal policies and the macroeconomic environment are incredibly important. There's no doubt about that. But if you think about what can happen in the next 4 years, you could consider that there are federal incentives and there are state incentives, and those might be independent of each other. So yes, there are tax credits that come at the federal level. There are also renewable energy credits or SRECs, solar RECs. Those are programs that are determined on a state by state basis and incentivize development. So interestingly, if we had a map of the US in front of us, most solar is not developed in the states sort of across the southern belt of the US, where solar would be, if you think about it, the most profitable, if profit were tied to the sun shining the most time, most hours of the day. In fact, most solar is built in the states where state incentives, like the Northeast, Massachusetts has a great program, New Jersey, New York, etc. California being a huge one, where there are incentives to help build these technologies. So in the absence of federal strategies that might be supportive, there are always other options. And then I'd like to share that there's, of course, finance. People have raised funds already on the promise of working on renewables and the energy transition. They're still going to figure out how to make those investments profitable. But if you have, just secured maybe tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions for a fund focus in this area, you have to deploy that capital. So you're going to still be working to get those dollars out the door. And depending on the mandate of your fund, it may be that you have to keep investing in climate and renewable tech, which could be exciting and keep the financing flowing. Then we have, I see some tax credit questions. I don't know if we'll get to the tax credit questions. It's quite a lot here. And one of the questions here, thanks, Susan, on bridge financing mechanisms to help municipalities take advantage of the IRA money without fronting the tax credit. I think there could be a lot to pull apart to answer this really clearly for people, but I'd share that bridge financing is certainly an emerging focus for some investors. often heard of now in the dialogue around private credit. So we've done bridge financing, we've done credit facilities that are focused on helping bring that money up front from something you're going to get. It doesn't need to be your IRA dollars. It could be bridge financing until you receive the payment of a certain incentive. So now you have liquidity or cash up front in order to invest in those. And we've done that. Other credit programs are stepping in. And there's been some talk about this expanding field, a lot of funds raised on the basis of we think we could contract out. A bridge means a bridge to something more or less definite and defined, blanket idea, but still, we might be bridging to something that is coming in, and that means that we could have a structured return around that. So we could be a debt or a credit lender, and that is a field that has gotten a lot of interest from investors. VC has been relatively challenged. It's really hard to think of getting a huge multiple of return on your capital given this environment, which is what a lot of VC funds need in order to return their fund. And so credit and trying to figure out a structure a bridge to some type of incentive, federal, state, etc. dollar is an exciting field. And that's one thing that we're working on. I'm guessing we're going to keep seeing more of it. And some of the more rapidly developing or evolving sectors, geothermal, geologic hydrogen, hybrid energy, and intention towards heat versus power, are all emerging. Are we seeing any of these? We are. And embedded in that question, I'd share that if you think of something like a deep geothermal project, you could have just a geothermal air pump that sits in this window at the, air source heat pump at the Williams Inn, and that trades off the difference between the temperature of the air outside and the air inside. And that's one electric solution to heat or cool a room. You could also be talking about geothermal as far as drilling, drilling hundreds of feet, drilling either, a loop in your backyard or deep underground in order to access that differential in heat between where you're drilling and where the air is outside, and being able to circulate the air in order to, or circulate the temperature by way of some medium, it could be fluid, etc., in order to heat, not just power, and to do that in a way that doesn't rely on burning something. So geothermal can be small, consumer, and it could be a very big undertaking that requires a lot of capital expenditure, almost like digging a mine, and really a lot like digging an oil well. So geothermal in some capacities, or carbon storage, there are a lot of caveats around drilling deep into the ground to support these new technologies, something that might store the carbon that comes from the air or provide us with clean heat, and that we don't have to combust anything to get it. But a potential positive for us, particularly in the upcoming few years, is that it's the oil and gas companies that are already good at doing those things, and they can see a return on their investment if they dedicate some of their business to doing this type of work. This could be a controversial path forward because there's perhaps a lack of trust on the renewable side with some of the oil and gas majors and oil field services groups that have made goals before and then changed them. There's a lot to go into there that Williams graduates would be really well positioned to write a number of great papers on. But as we just think about, between the misaligned incentives, which are strong, there is an aligned incentive on if this technology, this heating technology, requires us doing what we do best, that's going to be perhaps an easier sell. Keep your business, but dedicate part of it to drilling in order to get the geological formation access that we need to store hydrogen, store carbon, or to bring heat up from the earth. So I'm going to choose to be excited that those companies have something to do that is in this space. And I'll share that we are seeing a bit of an exciting expansion of geothermal. There are now, I am a few blocks away from the first all-electric skyscraper. Very hard to electrify something as big as a skyscraper in New York City, but that's underway and there are a number of other projects as well. So pretty exciting. Let's see this other question. Actually, we are just about at time. So this is going to be my last answer. Thank you for the nudge on that from the team here. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been a lot of fun talking through something that I care about, both here with the students and with all of you. So really appreciate your engagement. Have a super warm and delightful afternoon.